The Alpha King brings an Omega. He loves to a poorhouse to test her. What she did shocked him. They made Tamsin Reed kneel on the marble of the Hall of Bells before anyone bothered to tell her what she was accused of, and when the accusation finally came, it was not a crime at all. It was her poverty. Alpha King Rennick Oberon sat above her on the black stone throne of Calderas, his knuckles white on the armrest, and read aloud the decree his own council had drafted. That the Omega he intended to take as queen would be stripped of name, coin, title, and protection, and delivered to Crown Almshouse No. 4 at Hollow Row, there to live one full turning of the moon among the destitute, watched by appointed observers, so that the realm might learn whether she loved the man or the throne. He did not look at her while he read it. That, more than the words, was what cut. The hall smelled of cold brass and beeswax, and the faint animal warmth of 200 lichen bodies pretending to be still. Somewhere above, in the bell tower that gave the hall its name, the great bronze mouths hung silent. They had not rung in 9 years, not since the old king died, and the court had grown superstitious about the quiet. 1 month, said Chancellor Marden Locke, stepping forward with the pleasant, unhurried voice of a man reading a shopping list. He was 60 and elegant, and had the sort of face that people described afterward as kind, which was a useful thing for a face to do. A charity, truly. If she is what His Majesty believes, 30 days will prove it. If she is what the rest of us fear, an ambitious girl with a pretty scent and a debt collector's patience, 30 days will prove that too. The realm has been generous with its doubts. Let it be generous with its evidence. Laughter moved through the gallery like wind through wheat. Tamsin heard it in pieces. The high, bright giggle of a girl from House Marrow. The low chuckle of some baron who had never in his life gone hungry on purpose. Her knees ached against the marble. She had been made to kneel on this floor for 11 minutes now, and the cold had gone all the way into the bone. She lifted her head. "May I ask a question, Chancellor?" Locke's eyebrows rose in delighted surprise, as though a chair had spoken. "By all means." "Who lives in Almshouse No. 4? The question landed strangely. It was not the question anyone had prepared for. Locke had answers ready for "how dare you," and "this is an outrage," and "my lord, please." He had spent 3 days sharpening them. "Paupers," he said. "The infirm, the indigent, those without kin or coin. How many?" "I could not say." "You are Chancellor of the Exchequer," Tamsin said. "You sign the bread warrant for every crown almshouse in Calderas. No. 4 draws grain for 140 souls each quarter." She let that sit exactly 1 heartbeat. "I mended shirts for the laundry on Ash Lane for 6 years, my lord. The almshouse sends its washing there because they cannot afford lye. 140 people, and 11 shirts a week. I always wondered where the rest of them were." The silence that followed had a texture. Rennick Oberon's head turned at last, and for the first time since she had been dragged into this hall, he looked directly at her, and she saw the thing she had come to love and to fear in equal measure. The way his golden eyes went very still when something had just rearranged itself behind them. Locke smiled. "You see, Majesty, clever. I have never doubted she was clever." 30 days, said the king. His voice was low, and it carried the way a struck bell carries. "She goes tonight." The carriage that took her was not a carriage. It was a grain wagon with the crown's antlered wolf burned into the boards, and Tamsin rode in the back with her hands folded in her lap and her boots. Good boots, the only good things she owned, bought with 2 years of saved mending money. Laced tight, because she had a suspicion someone would try to take them. They had let her keep 3 things. The rules of the decree allowed personal effects of no value. A bone comb, a folded square of undyed linen, and a brass thimble worn smooth and thin at the crown, engraved so faintly that you had to catch it in low light to see anything at all. She turned the thimble now, tilting it toward the lantern swinging on its hook. A wolf. And above the wolf, half worn away. A circle of small points that might have been a crown, or might have been the tooth marks of a child who had chewed it as a teether 22 years ago in a room she could no longer remember. Her mother had died when Tamsin was 6. She had left behind a thimble, a lullaby, and a habit of flinching whenever someone knocked at the door after dark. The wagon crossed the Sallow Bridge, and the city changed the way a face changes when it stops being polite. Gas lamps thinned. The gutters ran with something that had been snow in the morning. And then Hollow Row itself, a long gray street of tenements leaning into one another like exhausted men. And at the end of it, squatting behind a wall too high for its purpose, Crown Almshouse No. 4. It smelled from 50 feet away of lye and wet wool and coal smoke and boiled turnip and, underneath everything, the sweet rot smell of a building that has been damp for 100 years and has stopped fighting about it. 2 men waited at the gate with the observers' brass armbands. Neither of them looked at her face. One made a note in a book before she had done anything at all. "Name?" said the gatekeeper. "Tamsin. Family name." She thought of the decree. Stripped of name. "None," she said. He wrote none in the register with an ugly satisfaction, and that was how Tamsin Reed became, for 30 days, nobody at all. The matron of No. 4 was a broad, red-armed woman named Beryl Hask, who had the flat, exhausted competence of a surgeon in a losing war. She looked Tamsin over once. The good boots, the mended but clean dress, the hands. "Seamstress?" "Yes." "Left-handed?" "Yes." "Then you'll do the buttonholes and I won't hear a word about your eyes going. Everybody's eyes go. Mine went at 34. She jerked her chin at the corridor. "Women's ward is up the stairs, second door. There's a bed by the window. The window's why it's free. Don't take the blanket off the bed nearest the stove no matter what they tell you. That's Winnie's, and Winnie will bite." "How many people live here, matron?" Hask's eyes flicked to the 2 observers loitering by the door, then away. "Enough," she said, and walked off. The women's ward was 30 beds in a room built for 16. The ceiling sagged. A stove at the far end gave out a red, insufficient heat, and around it the residents had arranged themselves in the way people always arrange themselves around scarce warmth, by seniority, by ferocity, by grief. Tamsin's bed was under the window, and the window did not close, and the cold came through it in a steady, patient river. She sat down on the straw tick and put her hands over her face for the length of 6 breaths. That was all she allowed herself. She had learned that trick at 11, in the workhouse laundry on Ash Lane, and it had held up remarkably well against everything life had thrown at it since, including falling in love with a king. When she took her hands away, a child was staring at her. The girl was perhaps 7, with a shaved head from the lice season and eyes far too calm for her age. She was holding a wooden spoon, like a weapon. "You're the one from the palace," the girl said. "I'm the one from Ash Lane. They said the king's woman was coming to see how we live." "They said that to you?" "Ivo said it. Ivo says everything." The girl considered her. "Are you going to write about us in a book and then go home?" Tamsin looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said. "I'm going to fix that window, because I intend to sleep under it for a month and I'd rather not die of it. Do you know where I can get a board?" The girl's face did something complicated. Suspicion tripping over surprise. "Prue," she said, which appeared to be her name and also somehow her answer. "There's boards under the coal stair. Tobin gets them. Tobin gets everything." Tobin turned out to be 10 years old, sharp as a fishhook, and coughing. Tamsin heard the cough before she saw the boy. A wet, layered, hollow sound that came up from somewhere below the ribs and did not fully finish before it began again. She knew that cough. Everyone from Ash Lane knew that cough. It lived in damp rooms and it took 11 months to kill a child, and the almshouse doctors called it lung rot and wrote consumption on the register because consumption sounded like fate instead of like a landlord. He brought her 3 boards and a bent nail and demanded, as payment, the truth about the palace. "It's cold," said Tamsin, hammering the first board across the gap with the heel of her boot. "Colder than this. Marble holds cold the way a well holds water. There are 160 rooms and no one lives in 90 of them, and they keep fires lit in everyone so that the pipes don't burst." Tobin's eyes went wide. Fires in empty rooms? 90 fires. Every night. That's stupid. "Yes," said Tamsin. "It is." He grinned at her, and then the grin broke into another coughing fit that bent him double, and she held his shoulders until it passed and felt, through his shirt, the ladder of his spine. Behind her, one of the observers wrote something in his book. That night, the lullaby. Tamsin had not meant to sing. Prue would not settle. The child had woken twice with the flat animal panic of someone who has learned that nights are when things are taken. And Tamsin, half asleep herself, began humming the only thing her hands remembered from being small. "Bell and bone and the silver thread, count the moons above your bed. One for the road and one for the door, one for the girl they're looking for." She got as far as the 3rd line before a voice came out of the dark near the stove, cracked, dry, and absolutely awake. "Where did you learn that?" It was not a question. It had the shape of an accusation. The woman by the stove sat up. She was ancient in the way that only the very poor get ancient. Her face a map of a country that had stopped issuing passports. Winifred Sorrell, 91 years old by the register, though the register had been wrong about her twice. "My mother," Tamsin said. "Your mother's name." "Aline." Something happened in the old woman's face. It happened slowly, the way ice moves. "Aline," Winnie repeated. "Aline what?" "Reed. Aline Reed." "That's not her name," said Winnie Sorrell, and lay back down, and would not say another word for 2 days, no matter how Tamsin asked. The work at number 4 began at 5, and it was, in its way, ingenious in its cruelty. The women picked oakum, old tarred ship's rope, unraveled by hand into loose fiber for caulking, 3 pounds a day per pair of hands. Tarred hemp is not soft. It takes the skin off your fingertips in the first week, and after that, your fingers simply stop having prints on them, which is why the almshouse guards like the work. A person without fingerprints cannot be identified when found, and Hollow Rose residents were found rather often. Tamsin picked oakum in the mornings and mended in the afternoons, and in the evenings she did the thing that would eventually undo an entire kingdom, though she had no idea of it at the time. She taught Prue her letters. It began as a way to keep the child quiet, scratching shapes on a slate with a nail. A is for the roof of a house. B is for 2 fat bellies. But within 4 days, there were 3 children around the slate, and within a week there were 9, and Matron Hask stood in the doorway watching with her arms folded and an expression that Tamsin could not read at all. "They'll only be disappointed," Hask said at last. "By what?" "By finding out what's written." On the 9th night, Tamsin went looking for the ledgers. She told herself it was the 11 shirts. 140 souls drawing grain, 11 shirts a week going to the laundry on Ash Lane, and in 9 days of living here she had counted the beds in every ward, twice, at different hours, and arrived at the same number each time. 62. 62 people, drawing bread for 140. The clerk's office was behind the kitchen, and its door had a silver latch. Silver, in a lichen almshouse, because silver against a shifter's palm burns like a held coal, and the Crown had decided long ago that this was cheaper than a lock. Every resident of number 4 knew that door could not be opened. Tamsin wrapped her hand in her skirt out of habit, hesitated, and then, because some part of her had been circling this for years without permission to land, put her bare palm flat against the silver. Nothing. Cold metal. No burn, no blister. No white searing kiss. Nothing at all. She stood very still in the dark, with her hand on a medal that should have marked her, and felt the floor of her life shift about 1/4 of an inch. Then she opened the door. The ledgers were bound in green cloth, 1 per year, going back further than she had expected. The earliest spines were cracked, and the dates were in a hand that used the old long S. She lit a stub of candle inside the coal scuttle so the light wouldn't show under the door, and she started with the current year, because the current year was where the 11 shirts lived. She found it in under an hour. The grain warrant, 140 measures received. And beneath it, in a second column headed only transferred, in Martin Locke's own looping, elegant, unhurried hand, 78 measures. Bonded removals. Bonded removals. Not deaths. Not discharges. There were separate columns for those, neatly kept. This was something else, and it had a rhythm to it. 3 names in March, 5 in April, 11 in June. Children, mostly. She could tell because the ages were listed. Her hands had gone cold. She turned back a year, and then another, and another, following the bonded removals column down through a decade like a rope down a well. And the further she went, the more the names blurred, and the faster she turned, and she was 22 years back, the candle guttering, her breath loud, when she stopped. Because there, in the column, in a hand long dead, was an entry that made no sense at all. Removed, Ardenmore, Aline, age 19, infant female, unnamed, in arms. Bond purchased, house lock. Note, silver thread, confirm with Chancellor before disposal. Somewhere below her, in the corridor, a floorboard took a man's weight. The floorboard belonged to Ivo Kell, and Ivo Kell was 17, and he had a knife. He was not, Tamsin understood immediately, a boy who intended to use it. He held it the way people hold a thing they have been told will keep them safe. Too tightly. Too far from his body. Pointed slightly at the floor. "You're not supposed to be in here," he said. "Neither are you. I have permission." "From whom?" The knife wavered. In the coal scuttle light, his face was all cheekbone and hunger, and there was tar under his nails from the oakum, and a fresh brass button on his coat that did not belong to the coat. "You're the one who watches for them," Tamsin said. "The observers. They pay you to write down what I do. 3p a day." He said it defiantly, chin up, and then the defiance collapsed under its own weight. "It's 3p a day, and my sister's in the infirmary ward, and the infirmary ward gets meat twice a week if the matron's told to give it. You don't know." "I know exactly," said Tamsin. She closed the ledger. "I worked the Ash Lane laundry from 11 to 17. I sold my hair twice. The second time I got less because it was shorter." She stood, and the boy stepped back, and she made her voice as gentle as she knew how. "Ivo, do the observers ever ask you about anything other than me?" "No." "Do they ever ask about the Wagons?" The knife came down. "You're not supposed to know about the Wagons," he whispered. 60 miles of protocol and 11 feet of thrown away. Rennick Oberon was not sleeping either. He stood at the window of the bell tower, with the great bronze mouths hanging silent above him, and hated himself with the specific, useless efficiency of a man who has done a cowardly thing for a reason he can defend. The reason was in his hand. It was a document, and it was called the Instrument of Confidence, and it required the signatures of 9 of the 12 great houses to declare a monarch unfit to bind. He had 7 signatures against him. Locke had gathered them in a fortnight. "You cannot marry her," the Chancellor had said, in that pleasant, unhurried voice, laying the paper on the table between them like a man laying down a winning card he regretted holding. "Not because she is poor, Majesty. Poverty is romantic. The ballad sellers would adore it. You cannot marry her because she is unregistered. She has no bond, no house, no attested line. If you crown an Omega whose blood cannot be traced, then every indenture bond in Calderas becomes questionable, because every one of them rests on the principle that unregistered blood has no standing. 40 years of contracts, Majesty. 6 million crowns of paper held by 7 of the 12 houses whose signatures I am holding. And then, kindly, as if offering him an umbrella. Unless, of course, she proves herself, publicly. Let the realm watch her earn what she cannot inherit. 30 days of visible virtue, and I will burn this instrument myself and stand at your wedding and weep. Rennick had been king of Calderas for 9 years. He had ended the border war at Thistledown with a treaty instead of a slaughter, and faced down 2 challenges to his throat in the circle, bare, and won both. And he had looked at that document and thought, 30 days is nothing. She will walk through this, and come out shining, and they will have no ground left to stand on. He had thought it was protection. It had taken him 9 days to understand that a test is not protection. A test is a doubt, with a schedule. Bring me the coal carter's coat, he said to his shield man, the one from the Thistledown business. Majesty, the coat, Halloran. He came on the 11th morning with 100 weight of coal on his back, and soot rubbed into his jaw. And Tamsin knew him before he had crossed the yard, because a scent is not a thing you can rub soot over. She did not run to him. She was sitting on an upturned crate by the kitchen door, with a basin of gray water and a boy's shirt in it, and she went on scrubbing. You're doing that wrong, said the king of the lichen realm, setting down his sack. I've been doing it since I was 11. Then you've been doing it wrong since you were 11. Come and show me then. He came and knelt on the whetstone beside her, and put his hands in the freezing water. And Tamsin watched the most powerful alpha in 6 kingdoms discover what lie does to knuckles. Ah, he said. That's quite bad. You get 3 weeks of it before the skin toughens. Prue's hands split open every winter and heal every spring, and by the time she's 20, they'll stop healing. Tamsin wrung the shirt out. Her voice, when it came again, was very level. How long have you known about the bonded removals? Rennick went completely still. Beside the basin, a drip of gray water fell from his hand and did not apparently land. The what? She looked at him then, and she believed him. That was the terrible part. And she would turn it over for years afterward. The fact that she had looked into his face and believed him instantly, because a man who is genuinely ignorant of a thing has a particular blankness that cannot be manufactured. Number 4 draws grain for 140, she said quietly. There are 62 of us. The difference is written down in your chancellor's own hand under a heading called bonded removals. And it is not a column of deaths, because deaths have their own column, and they are counted honestly. It is a column of people, mostly children. 11 in June. That's not possible. You're the king of Calderas, said Tamsin. Everything is possible. That's the whole difficulty with you. He was quiet a long while. Then he took something from inside the coal carter's coat and pressed it into her wet hand and closed her fingers over it. A plain iron ring, black, unlovely, stamped inside the band with the antlered wolf. A king's token, he said. Any garrison, any gate, any hour. Show it, and they must give you whatever you ask once, and ask no questions. Use it to walk out of here tonight, and I will meet the instrument of confidence with my teeth, and let the houses do their worst. Tamsin looked at the ring for a long moment. Then she put it in her apron pocket, unused, and went back to scrubbing the boy's shirt. 20 days left, she said. Here is a thing about the Registry of Omega Indenture that every citizen of Calderas knew, and almost none examined. It had begun as a mercy. 200 years earlier, orphaned Omegas had been prey, and the first registry was a list of names kept in a temple, so that someone could be asked, "Where is she?" and be obliged to answer. Then someone realized that a list of people who can be asked after is also a list of people who can be found. and a list of people who can be found is an asset, and an asset can be lent against. By Tamsin's lifetime, the Registry had become a market. Great houses purchased indenture bonds, the right to a registered Omega's labor, service, or bonding, and traded them, and hedged them, and used them as collateral against harvests, and shipping, and war. The bonds were sound, because the blood was traceable, and the blood was traceable because the Registry said so, and the Registry said so because it was the only thing permitted to say anything at all. There was exactly one event that could vaporize the entire market overnight: a queen of untraceable blood on the throne, whose very existence proved that standing did not require a registry entry. Chancellor Martin Locke held 400,000 crowns of those bonds personally. He had never been sadistic in his life. He had simply never once, in 60 years, found a reason to prefer a person over a portfolio. Winnie Sorrell began speaking on the 13th day, and once she began, she did not stop for 4 hours. She spoke sitting up in her bed nearest the stove, with her hands around a cup of willow bark tea that Tamsin had brewed for her joints, and with Prue and Tobin and 2 other children arranged on the floor like a congregation, and Ivo Kell standing in the doorway, pretending to be on his way somewhere else. "There was a queen before your king's father," Winnie said. "Not a consort. A queen in her own blood, Seraphine of Ardenmoor, and she was an Omega. And she was the last one crowned in this country, and there'll never be another. They made sure of it." She drank. "You've heard she died of fever." "Everyone's heard that," said Tamsin. "She died of a registry." The stove popped. Nobody moved. Seraphine wanted it abolished. Said a list of people is only ever a step from a list of prices. She had the votes. She'd worked 11 years for the votes, and she had them. And she was to put it to the Assize of Bells in the spring. Winnie's mouth thinned. She took a fever in the winter. Very sudden, very tidy. Her daughter was 7 and the child was declared unregistered, which meant she had no standing to inherit, which meant the line was extinct, which meant the bonds were safe. And the girl went into a Crown Almshouse under a clerk's name, and nobody ever looked for her again, because there was no name to look for. She lifted her eyes. "Aline," she said. That was the clerk's name they gave her. She was 7 and she couldn't say her own anymore. And I was 38, and I scrubbed the floors of this building, and I taught that child a counting song so she'd remember, because a song will live in a mouth longer than a name will live in a register. Bell and bone, and the silver thread. Tamsin's hands had gone entirely numb. "She got out at 19, Winnie said. Ran. 9 months later, they had her back through that gate with a baby in her arms, and I hid her 3 days in the coal cellar, and on the 4th day I stood in that yard, and I watched a wagon take her. And I have been in this building 53 years since, waiting to find out what happened to the baby." The old woman set her cup down. Her hands were shaking so badly that the cup rang against the saucer, 3 small bell notes in a silent room. "Show them the thimble, girl." It was brass. It was thin at the crown from 20 years of a needle's pressure, and thinner still from something older. And when Tobin held it up to the window and turned it, all of them saw what low gray light will show that lamplight will not. A wolf, and above the wolf a coronet of 7 points, and around the rim in letters worn nearly to nothing, Seraphine R. "It's a sewing thimble," said Prue, disappointed. "It's a signet," said Winnie Sorrell. "That a clever woman hammered into a sewing thimble so that her daughter could carry it through a search." Tamsin did not sleep that night, and she did not weep, and she did not do any of the 11 things that a story would have had her do. She got out of bed at 2 in the morning, went down to the clerk's office, put her bare hand on the silver latch, and began to copy. She copied by candle stub until her eyes swam. The bonded removals column for 11 years, name by name, age by age, purchaser by purchaser, onto the backs of pattern papers and laundry tickets and fly leaves torn from 3 ruined psalters. And when her hand cramped past use, she went upstairs and woke Prue, and Prue woke Tobin, And by the fourth night, there were 9 children sitting cross-legged on the floor of the women's ward at 2 a.m, copying columns of numbers they could barely read in the wobbling, careful hand of the newly literate. "Why 9 of us?" Tobin asked, on the 5th night, between coughs. "Because 1 copy can be burned," said Tamsin. He thought about that with his whole face, the way children do. "And 9 can't? 9 is harder," she said. "9 is much, much harder." She did not say the rest of it, which was, "And if they are in 9 different hands, in 9 different pockets, on 9 different children, then to destroy the evidence a man would have to do something in public that he could never explain." She gave Tobin willow bark for the fever and mullein leaf steeped in hot water for the cough, and made him breathe the steam under a blanket twice a day, and after a week his lips were less blue and he could climb the coal stair without stopping. Mullein does not cure lung rot. It loosens what the lungs are drowning in, and buys a body time to fight, which is not nothing, and in Hollow Row, nothing was the usual dosage. Lady Sabine Crestwood arrived on the 19th day in a carriage with glass windows, which the children had never seen, and stood in the yard of Crown Almshouse No. 4 in pale grey silk, holding a scented handkerchief to her face, without any apparent awareness of what that gesture said. She was 26, beautiful in the arranged way of the very well-bred. She was the woman the council intended Rennick Oberon to marry, and she was Mardenloch's niece. "So you're her," said Sabine. "I'm her." "You're smaller than they said." Sabine's eyes went past Tamsin, cataloguing. The sagging roof, the pump, the children pretending not to stare. 11 days left. My uncle is prepared to offer you 2,000 crowns and passage to Marrow if you walk out that gate tonight and write a letter saying you found the life beneath you. Nobody would blame you. Half the court would find it charmingly honest. No, 3,000. Lady Sabine. Tamsin dried her hands on her apron. "Do you want to marry him?" The question hit somewhere unarmored. Sabine's chin came up 1/2 inch. "That is a remarkably vulgar thing to ask. It's the only thing I've asked you." For a moment, something moved behind the woman's face, and Tamsin, who had spent 6 years reading customers across a laundry counter, saw it clearly. Not jealousy. Something much older and more tired than jealousy. Sabine turned to go, and as she turned her sketchbook slipped from under her arm and fell open in the mud, and Tamsin picked it up. It was not a lady's sketchbook of flowers and fashions. It was Hollow Row, page after page of it. The leaning tenements, the pump with the broken handle, the almshouse wall from below, always from below, always from the height of a small child, drawn over and over across years, in a hand that had started clumsy and grown very fine. Sabine took it back so fast the page tore. "My mother," she said, in a voice with all the silk gone out of it, "came out of this building in 61. Bond purchased by my father. That is what a bond purchase is, and I have spent my entire life being the proof that it can turn out well." She held the ruined book against her chest. "Don't look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you're sorry for me," said Lady Sabine Crestwood. "I am the luckiest woman in Calderas. Everyone says so." She got into her carriage with the glass windows and did not look back, and 3 of the children ran alongside it to the end of Hollow Row, just to watch the light move on the panes. The bond wagon came on the 22nd night. Tamsin woke to the sound of the yard gate, not the creak of it, but the absence of the creak, because someone had oiled the hinges in advance, and it was the wrongness of that silence that pulled her out of sleep, with her heart already hammering. She got to the window in time to see 4 men in the dark, and Matron Hask standing at the door with a lantern, and her face turned deliberately away, and the observers' brass armbands catching the light as they held the register open like ushers at a wedding. And she got to the top of the stairs in time to see them carry Tobin out. He was not struggling. That was the thing she would remember. He had a sack over his head, and he was not struggling at all, and his bare feet hung down. and there was a paper pinned to the back of his nightshirt with a number on it. Tamsin ran, and Ivo Kell caught her around the waist at the bottom of the stairs and put his hand over her mouth and hissed, "If they see you, they take you too, and then there's nobody left who can read." The gate closed without a sound, and in the terrible quiet of the yard, Tamsin Reed heard the wagon wheels start to turn and understood that she had exactly 8 days, 1 thimble, and 9 children with copied ledgers standing behind her on the dark stair. Matron Beryl Hask broke at 7 in the morning over porridge in front of everyone. Tamsin had not shouted. She had not accused. She had simply walked the length of the dining hall with the register under her arm, set it down open on the matron's table, put her finger on the line where a clerk had already written Tobin Carey, discharged to kin, and said, "He hasn't got any kin. You told me so yourself on my 3rd day." Hask looked at the page. 61 people looked at Hask. "Get away from my table." "Where do the wagons go?" "Get away from my table." Matron. Tamsin crouched down so that their eyes were level, and lowered her voice to something almost tender, which was infinitely worse. "You keep the honest columns honest. Deaths, discharges, the bread count, all of it. Perfect. 12 years of it. Nobody does that unless some part of them is still keeping a record for somebody. Who are you keeping it for?" The big red-armed woman put both hands flat on the table, and her mouth went out of shape, and the sound that came out of her was not weeping so much as a structure failing. "Davy," she said, "my boy, 19 years ago. He was 6. She dragged her sleeve across her face. "They said if I stayed and kept the house quiet, he'd be well kept, wherever he was, and every quarter they let me have a line of a letter, 4 words. He is in health. 19 years of 4 words in a stranger's hand. And I have kept every ledger in this building true as a plumb line, so that when somebody finally came looking, there'd be something to find." She looked up at Tamsin, ruined. "You came looking," she said. "Where do the wagons go?" "Sallow Key, the old customs house. They call it the sorting." "They went at dusk. Tamsin, Ivo Kell, and because there was no force in the world that could have prevented it, Winifred Sorrell, 91 on Ivo's arm, moving down Hollow Row at the pace of a glacier and swearing at every cobble." The old customs house at Sallow Key had been derelict since Tamsin was a girl. It was not derelict now. There were 2 lamps burning, and a horse in the yard, and a man on the door. Tamsin took the iron ring out of her apron. "Any garrison, any gate, any hour," she said, once. "You were saving that," Ivo hissed. "You were saving that to get yourself out." "I was saving it to be useful. This is the useful part." She walked into the lamplight with the ring held up, and the man on the door saw the antlered wolf and went the color of paper, and stood aside and asked no questions. Inside, the customs house had been fitted out with the calm, sensible, well-lit efficiency of an institution that has never once thought of itself as evil. There were 41 children in the long room. They were clean. They were fed. There was a bread cart, and it was full. They sat on benches in numbered order with paper tags pinned to their nightshirts, and at the far end, under a good lamp, a bored man in a gray coat was working down the line with a pair of tongs. The tongs held a strip of silver. He touched it to the inside of each child's wrist. Most of them screamed and jerked and were sent left, through a door, back toward the wagons, burned, ordinary, unremarkable, to be returned to whatever almshouse they had been borrowed from with a fresh entry in the discharge column. Some of them did not scream. Those were sent right. Tamsin stood in the doorway of the old customs house and watched the sorting of Calderas' children by whether or not silver burned them, and understood, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, everything. Bonded removals. Not a market in labor. A search. For 22 years, Marden Locke had been running a sieve through the poorest wards of the kingdom, testing every foundling and orphan and pauper child for the one trait that the Ardenmore line carried in its blood and could not hide: silver that did not bite. Because the line was not extinct. A line is never extinct, only unrecorded. And every unrecorded Ardenmore child in a Crown Almshouse was a lit fuse under 6 million crowns of paper. He had not been stealing children. He had been closing a position. Tobin was at the far end of the right-hand bench with his tag pinned to his chest, and when he saw her, his face broke open, and he coughed and shouted her name. Getting him out was the easy part. The ring had already done that work. Getting out with all 41 was not possible, and Tamsin knew it before Ivo said it, and hated her own arithmetic the whole way home. But she had 2 hours in that building with a king's token in her hand, and a doorman told to ask no questions, and she did not waste them. She read the sorting book. She copied the running total: 906 children tested since the year 60, and the disposal column, and the 2 words at the head of the right-hand list, which were not bonded or removed but simply confirmed, and the standing order beneath, signed with an elegant, unhurried hand: confirmed subjects to be bonded singly, to separate houses, at distances not less than 100 miles, records severed, not killed. That was the thing that would sicken her worst, later in the retelling. Marden Locke had never in his life ordered a child killed. He had ordered them scattered, sold one at a time into households 100 miles apart, their papers cut, their names replaced. Because a dead child is a crime, and a lost child is only a clerical outcome. And because a man who has never done anything he could be hanged for sleeps very well indeed. And in the last third of the book, in an entry from 61, she found: confirmed, Sorrell, female infant. Bond purchased, House Crestwood. Note: raised as issue, Chancellor's discretion, Sorrell. Tamsin turned around slowly. Winnie was sitting on an upturned crate by the door with her hands folded, looking at nothing. "Winnie," she said, "did you have a daughter?" The old woman did not look up. "They told me she was born dead," said Winifred Sorrell. "I have believed that for 65 years. It has been the great fact of my life. Please do not take it away from me at 91, unless you are entirely certain." Lady Sabine Crestwood came to Hollow Row for the second time at 2 a.m, on foot, without a carriage, in a servant's cloak. She stood in the wet yard and held out a folded paper as though it might bite her. "My mother's bond certificate," she said. "I have never once looked at it. My father kept it in the muniment room behind the deed to the fishing rights, which tells you exactly how he thought of it. I looked at it tonight." Tamsin unfolded it under the lamp. "Crestwood, Isolde, formerly Sorrell. Bond purchased 61. Note, silver thread, Chancellor's discretion, raised as issue." "Explain to me what that means," said Sabine, and her voice was doing something appalling and careful. "Because I have read it 11 times, and I find that I would rather hear it from a laundress in a yard than from my uncle in a drawing room, and I do not know what that says about my life." So Tamsin told her, standing in the mud at 2 a.m, and she did not soften any of it, that the woman Sabine had buried 3 years ago, Isolde Crestwood, who wore lavender, who was frightened of dogs, who could never explain why, had been born in Crown Almshouse No. 4 to a floor scrubber called Winifred Sorrell. That she had been taken at 2 days old because silver did not burn her. That she had not been scattered like the others because she was beautiful, and the Chancellor had a nephew-in-law with debts, and a use for a wife who could never, ever ask questions about her own origins. That the woman who had scrubbed the floors of this building for 53 years waiting was asleep in a bed by the stove 40 feet away. That Sabine Crestwood, Lady of Marrow Hall, betrothed by the will of 7 great houses to the Alpha King of Calderas, was the granddaughter of a pauper, and carried in her blood the very thing her uncle had spent his life erasing. Sabine did not cry. Tamsin watched her not cry with something close to admiration. "He was going to marry me to the king," she said at last, wonderingly, knowing. Yes, because a queen who doesn't know what she is can't abolish anything. Sabine laughed, one dry crack of it. God, he is so tidy. She looked up at the sagging black bulk of the almshouse. Is she awake? She wakes at 4. She always wakes at 4. Then I shall wait, said Lady Sabine Crestwood, and sat down on an upturned crate in the mud of Hollow Row in a cloak worth more than the building. The fire started at 3:30 on the 26th night, in the clerk's office, which had a silver latch that no shifter could open, and one small window that had been forced from the outside. Tamsin got Prue and 4 others down the coal stair. Ivo went back twice. Matron Hask stood in the yard with the water chain and roared like a bear and got 61 people out of a burning building in 11 minutes flat, which is a thing nobody in Calderas ever put in a ledger. Nobody died. The women's ward was gutted. The clerk's office burned to a shell, and with it 12 years of green-bound ledgers, and the grain warrants, and the register with none written beside the name Tamsin, and every honest column that Beryl Hask had kept true as a plumb line for 19 years, in the hope that somebody would come looking. Tamsin stood in the yard in the orange light with her arm around a 7-year-old and watched the roof go in, and did not feel what she was expected to feel. She felt Locke's hand in it, of course. She felt the terrible pleasure of a man being predictable. And she felt, in the deep private place where a person keeps the things they cannot say out loud, the small, hard satisfaction of a woman who has spent 9 nights teaching 9 children to write and knows precisely where 9 copies are, because they are in 9 pockets, in 9 nightshirts standing in this yard right now, watching the fire. Ivo came and stood beside her. 9 is harder, he said. 9 is much, much harder. The king arrived at dawn. He came at the head of 40 riders with the sun behind him and the antlered wolf on every breast, and he came off his horse before it had properly stopped. And he crossed that yard, through the smoke and the ash and the standing water, with an expression that made grown alphas step out of his path. Tamsin was sitting on the edge of the horse trough. She had a burn along her left forearm and soot in her hair, and she had not slept. And when he reached her, he went down on one knee in the black mud, without any apparent thought about it at all. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it. The columns, the sorting, the tongs, the 906, the standing order, the 2 words at the head of the right-hand list. Winnie's daughter, Sabine's certificate, her own mother in a coal cellar for 3 days at 19 with a baby in her arms. Rennick Oberon listened without once interrupting, and by the end, his hands were shaking, and it was not with fear. "There is a clause," he said, "in the decree, the 5th clause. The observers appointed by the Chancellery may take such measures of verification as are customary." He looked at his own hands. "I read the first 4. I signed the 5th. He put you in number 4 because it was the last house that still held the Ardmore records, and he sent his own men in with you under my seal to test your wrist with silver, and confirm what you were, so that he could scatter you at 100 miles with your papers cut. And I signed it, Tamsin, because I thought 30 days was nothing. Stop. I thought I was protecting you." "You were testing me," said Tamsin Reed. "There's a difference, and the difference is that a test is a doubt with a schedule, and you gave my doubt to a man who trades in people." She stood up. "We can be sorry later. He'll be here within the hour." "He is already here," said the Chancellor of the Exchequer, from the gate. Marden Locke had come on foot, in grey, with 8 men of the Assize behind him, and a warrant in his hand. And his face was doing the kind thing that faces did around him. "Tamsin, formerly of Ash Lane, no attested name," he read. "You are charged before the Assize of Bells with the theft of Crown records, with the abduction of a bonded minor from a chartered facility, and with arson in a Crown property, resulting in the destruction of the very ledgers you claim to have found." He lowered the paper and smiled with genuine, unhurried warmth. "Which no longer exist, which no one but you has ever seen, which burned, most conveniently, in a fire that began in a room only you could open. 61 paupers stood in a burnt yard in the gray morning, and Tamsin turned, slowly, to look at the king of Calderas, at the man kneeling in the mud, whose seal was on the 5th clause, whose own signature had put the tongs in that customs house, and asked the only question that mattered. "Well," she said, "do you believe me?" For 3 full seconds, Rennick Oberon did not move. 3 seconds is a very long time in a burnt yard. Later the ballad sellers would claim the king of Calderas tore the warrant from the chancellor's hand and threw it in the fire, because that is what ballads require. What he actually did was slower and far more dangerous. He got up out of the mud. "Chancellor," said Rennick Oberon, "you have laid a charge before the Assize of Bells." "I have, Majesty." "Then it will be heard by the Assize of Bells." The king turned to his shieldmen without raising his voice. "Halloran, ride, summon all 12 houses, both benches, the recorder, and the master of the rolls to the Hall of Bells at the 6th hour this evening, full quorum. Doors open to the commons, all of them, every gallery, no ticketing." He looked back at Locke. "You are quite right that the ledgers no longer exist, so we shall have to do this the old way, and hear people instead." Something crossed the Chancellor's kind face for the first time. "Majesty, a public assize on the word of a laundress." "On the word of a subject," said the king. "You've spent 3 weeks telling the realm she must earn her standing in front of witnesses. It seems churlish to stop now." They gave her a room in the east wing to wash in, and a dress, and 3 hours. Tamsin used 11 minutes for the washing and the dress, and spent the rest of it sitting at a window with a borrowed pen, writing out from memory, because she had read that sorting book twice, and she had been a woman who counted shirts for a living. Every figure she could hold. Rennick found her there at the 5th hour. "You should eat." "I should finish." He sat down across from her. In the good light, she could see what the last day had done to him. The burst blood vessel in one golden eye, the ash still in the seam of his jaw. "May I tell you what I expected?" he said. "I expected you to endure it. That was the whole of my imagination, Tamsin. 30 days of you cold and hungry and dignified while the court watched, and at the end I'd come and take you out and everyone would be ashamed of themselves. Endurance. Yours." He turned his hands over on the table. "Instead, you counted the beds. 11 shirts. You stood on my marble floor with your knees bleeding and asked how many people live there. And it took me 19 days to understand what you had actually done, which was open my kingdom's books in front of me and ask why they didn't balance. I brought you to a poorhouse to find out whether you were worthy of a throne, and you used the month to audit the crown." Tamsin put the pen down. "I wasn't being decent," she said. "I was being a seamstress. You cannot mend a thing until you find where the seam gave." She flexed her fingers. The tarred hemp had taken the prints off 2 of them. "Everyone at Ash Lane knows the arithmetic of poverty better than any chancellor. What we've never had is a room where anyone would let us say it out loud. Ma, you'll have the room tonight." "I know," said Tamsin. "That's why I'm still writing." The Hall of Bells at the 6th hour held 900 people and had been built for 400. They came up out of Hollow Row and Ash Lane and Sallow Key, dockers, laundresses, oakum pickers, the whole grey commons of Calderas, who had never in 200 years been told the doors were open, and filled the galleries and the stairs and the aisles, and stood 5 deep against the back wall, and the smell of that hall changed entirely, from cold brass and beeswax to wet wool and coal smoke and people. Marden Locke rose to open, and he was magnificent. He did not bluster. He was warm, precise, and sorrowful. He spoke of a young woman of undoubted charm and no education, overwhelmed by a hard month, who had built from confusion and grief a fantasy of conspiracy, and who had tragically destroyed the very documents that might have disproved her. He produced the fire report. He produced the observers, who swore the accused had entered the clerk's office at night 11 times. He produced the silver latch itself on a velvet cushion and held it up. "A door no shifter in Calderas can open," he said. "And one woman who could. Draw what conclusion you like." He sat down to a silence that had weight in it, and Tamsin Reed, standing alone at the bar of the Assize in a borrowed dress, said, "I'd like to call the house." The recorder blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Crown Almshouse No. 4, said Tamsin. "I'd like to call it, all of it." The doors at the back of the Hall of Bells opened. They came in 2 by 2 because Matron Hask had drilled them in the yard for an hour, and Matron Hask did not do things sloppily. 61 paupers in their burnt clothes walking up the center aisle of the Hall of Bells across the black and white marble, and at the head of them, 9 children. They had walked the whole way. They had their copies in their hands. Prue's was on the back of a laundry ticket. Tobin's was on 3 fly leaves torn from a psalter in a wobbling, careful hand, and he had to stop halfway up the aisle to cough, and 900 people waited for him. Ivo Kell laid the 9 copies on the recorder's table one at a time and said, clearly, to the whole hall, copied out at 2 a.m. by children who learned their letters 4 weeks ago, off ledgers I saw with my own eyes before they burned. Compare 'em. 9 hands, same numbers. "They can be fabricated," said Locke. "They can," agreed the recorder, who had been master of the rolls for 31 years and had a dry, awful fairness about him. 9 independent fabrications in 9 juvenile hands with consistent column arithmetic across 11 years would be, however, the single most impressive forgery in the history of this bench. Beryl Hask testified for 40 minutes and destroyed her own life doing it. She began by stating that she had knowingly falsified the discharge column of Crown Almshouse No. 4 on 94 occasions over 19 years under instruction, and that she wished the bench to note that this made her a criminal, and she would be pleased to be treated as one. Then she gave the 94 names. She had them by heart. She had had them by heart for 19 years. The 88th name was Davy Hask, age 6. The Chancellor's Counsel objected that the witness was self-confessedly perjured and therefore worthless, and the recorder observed dryly that a witness who arrives having already convicted herself has generally removed her own motive to lie. Then Winifred Sorrell was carried in on a chair by 2 dockers, because she could not manage the stairs. She had scrubbed the floors of that building for 53 years. She had never in her life been in a room with a painted ceiling, and she looked at it a while before she spoke, the way you look at weather. "I want to say a song," she said. "Madam, the bench requires evidence." "Then take it down as evidence," said Winnie Sorrell, and sang, in a voice like a hinge, "Bell and bone and the silver thread, count the moons above your bed. One for the road and one for the door, one for the girl they're looking for. I taught that to Seraphine of Ardenmoor's daughter in the winter of '39, she said, when they brought her into my house at 7 years old under a clerk's name and told her she had never had a mother. I taught it to her because a song will live in a mouth longer than a name will live in a register, and I had a suspicion, my lords, that registers in this country were not to be relied upon." She turned her head and found Tamsin at the bar. "Sing it," she said, and Tamsin sang it, and her voice was nothing special. And 900 people in the Hall of Bells listened to a counting rhyme that had been carried out of a murdered queen's nursery in the mouth of a floor scrubber, through a coal cellar, through a laundry on Ash Lane, into the highest court in Calderas, because it was the only inheritance that could not be confiscated. Then she laid the thimble on the recorder's table. The master of the rolls turned it to the window and read out, in his dry, 31-year voice, the letters worn nearly to nothing on the rim. Seraphine R. Locke did not break. Tamsin had not expected him to. Men like Locke do not break, they reprise. He rose and said with real dignity that a thimble proved nothing, that a song proved less, and that the bench was being asked to overturn 2 centuries of settled law on the strength of sentiment, and that even if every word of it were true, He had broken no statute of this realm. The registry was lawful. Bond purchase was lawful. Verification by silver was a customary measure, established in precedent. Removal and rebonding of unregistered minors was expressly permitted under the poor charter of 12. "I have broken no law," said Martin Locke, and he was telling the exact truth, and everybody in the hall knew it. "I have obeyed all of them. If you wish to hang me, my lords, you must first hang your own statute book." He sat down. And that was the moment, not the thimble, not the song, not the fire, when the Hall of Bells went truly quiet, because 900 people had just understood that the villain of the piece was not a man. Tamsin let the silence run. Then she said, "Yes, that's the charge." "I beg your pardon?" "You're quite right, Chancellor. You obeyed every law. That's what I'm asking this bench to look at." She turned to face the benches, and the galleries, and the 5-deep crowd at the back wall in their wet wool. 906 children were put in a room and touched with hot silver to see what they were made of, and not one clerk in this kingdom had to break a rule to do it. That is not a scandal about a chancellor. That is a machine, working correctly. "And your remedy?" the recorder asked. "Abolish it. You are, I am given to understand, about to be its queen." "No," said Tamsin Reed. "I'm not." The sound the hall made was not a gasp. It was worse. A long, low, rolling murmur, like a tide changing. "I won't take a crown while the registry stands," she said, "because a queen of unregistered blood is exactly what 6 million crowns of paper needs to be told is impossible. And if I sit on that throne with the registry still breathing, then in 20 years there will be another chancellor with another sieve, quietly making sure there's never another one of me. I don't want to be the exception. Exceptions are how machines survive." She set both hands on the bar. "Abolish the registry. Void the bonds. Then ask me again." Lady Sabine Crestwood was the last witness, and she was not on any list. She walked out of the gallery in pale gray silk, took the stand without being invited, and said, "I am Sabine Crestwood of Marrow Hall, niece by marriage to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and I am the woman 7 of the 12 houses have proposed to put on the throne in place of the accused." "My lady," said the recorder, "you understand you are not obliged." "I am wholly obliged," said Sabine, "just not by you." She produced her mother's bond certificate and read it aloud. Formerly, Sorrell. Silver thread. Chancellor's discretion. Raised as issue. She read it in a flat, carrying, beautifully educated voice, all the way to the end. And then she said, "My mother was taken from Crown Almshouse No. 4 at 2 days old. She was frightened of dogs her whole life and could never say why. She died 3 years ago believing she was the daughter of a Marrow shipping family, and my uncle stood at her graveside and said she had been a great ornament to her house." Sabine's hands were perfectly steady. "The woman you carried into this hall on a chair an hour ago is my grandmother. I met her 4 nights ago, sitting in the mud." She turned and looked at Martin Locke for the first time. "You were going to crown me," she said. "Knowing what I am, because a queen who doesn't know what she is can't abolish anything, and I would have been so grateful, Uncle. That's the part I can't forgive. Not what you did to them, what you were relying on in me." She stepped down, and it was then, into a hall where nobody was breathing, that a small voice from the front bench said, "Please, sir, my copy's got the sums for 61 in all." And Tobin Carey held up 3 fly leaves torn from a psalter and coughed, and the Hall of Bells came apart. The Assize of Bells sat for 11 hours. At 5:20 in the morning, by a vote of 9 houses to 3, it did 4 things. It struck down the Registry of Omega Indenture in its entirety, and voided every indenture bond in Calderas. 6 million crowns of paper, gone in a sentence, which ruined 4 great houses outright, and would take the kingdom a decade to survive. It established in its place an instrument called the Answer, a record any person might ask of on their own behalf or their kin's, and which no house, bank, or crown might ever purchase, pledge, or lend against. A list of people is not property, the statute read. It converted every Crown Almshouse into a chartered hall with an elected warden, an open ledger, and a standing right of inspection by any citizen who cared to walk through the door, which was, when the clerks costed it afterward, cheaper than the old way, a fact nobody found comforting. And it created the Commons of Bells, a second bench of 100 seats below the 12 houses, 60 reserved for persons who had lived in a Crown Almshouse. Its first act was to require the monarch of Calderas to answer its questions on the 4th day of every quarter, in person, with the doors open. Then it sentenced Marden Locke. They did not hang him. Tamsin asked them not to, and the reason she gave was the coldest thing she ever said in public. He is the only man alive who knows where they went. He was stripped of office, of estate, of the Crestwood connection, and of the honorific he had held for 30 years. His property was liquidated into a restitution fund, and he was set, under guard, at a desk in the Hall of Rolls, and given the sorting book, and told that he would remain there until the account was closed. 906 children, found, named, and, where they lived, and where they consented, restored to whatever remained of their kin. He worked at that desk for 11 years, and he was extremely good at it, which was somehow the worst indictment of all. He found Davy Hask in the 4th year, a wheelwright in Thistledown, 43 years old, alive, with 3 children. And Beryl Hask was released from her own sentence to travel there, and the account of that meeting is not written down anywhere, by her request. The last thing Marden Locke ever wrote was a name. He was found in the morning with the pen still in his hand at 611, and the rest were finished by clerks of the Commons who had been almshouse children themselves. And the bells rang. That is the part every version agrees on. When the recorder read the abolition of the Registry at 5:20 in the morning, some docker's boy who had climbed the tower on a dare hauled on the great rope, and the 9 bronze mouths that had hung silent over the Hall of Bells for 9 years opened at once, and the sound went out over Calderas in the dark and woke the entire city. Rennick Oberon came to her in the gray of the morning, on the steps, while the bells were still going. "Ask me again," he said. "That's not how I put it." "I know how you put it. The Registry's dead. I'm asking." Tamsin looked out over the square. 61 people from a burnt almshouse sat on the steps of the highest court in the kingdom eating bread somebody's aunt had brought in a barrow, and Prue was asleep against Ivo Kell's shoulder, with a laundry ticket still clutched in her fist. 1 month, said Tamsin. He went very still. Hollow Row, she said. No name, no coin, no title, no guard. You'll sleep in the men's ward and pick oakum with the rest. And at the end of it, if you still want to marry me, I'll say yes. She met his eyes. It isn't revenge, Rennick. It's the only apology that's worth anything. You didn't wrong me by doubting me. You wronged me by being able to afford to find out. So go and be unable to afford things for 30 days, and then come and tell me what you learned, and I'll listen the way you should have listened to me on that marble floor. The King of Calderas looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, one rough, disbelieving breath of it, and said, Do I get boots? You get whatever's in the bin. He went. That is the thing the ballad sellers never quite believed, and the thing every almshouse child in Calderas told each other for 100 years afterward, embellishing wildly. He picked oakum for 30 days, and his hands did not fully recover. For the rest of his reign, he signed documents with a grip that ached in the cold, which he described, to anyone who asked, as the most useful thing he owned. He was beaten once, badly, in a dispute over a blanket, by a man who had no idea who he was, and who later became the second warden of Hollow Row Hall. He came back on the 31st morning thinner, filthy and quiet, and stood in the yard, and Tamsin came out with her sleeves rolled and asked him what he had learned. That I have been running a kingdom on the assumption that people who don't complain are content, said Rennick Oberon. And that nobody down here complains because complaining is how you get moved to the top of a list. Yes, said Tamsin Reed. That's it. That's the whole of it. Marry me. Yes, she said. She was crowned in the spring, and she took the Ardenmore name back because Winnie Sorrell asked her to, and because there were 600 people alive in Calderas, with a claim to it now, who had spent their lives being told they had no line at all. Winnie lived to 94. She spent the last 3 years of her life in a small, warm room at Hollow Row Hall, with a granddaughter who visited every 8th day and eventually stopped bothering with the carriage, and she was, by every account, an absolute terror to the staff. Tobin Carey's lungs never came right. The Moulin bought him time, and time was all anyone could buy. He lived to be 38, and was for 11 of those years the first clerk of the Answer, and it was his rule, still on the statute in Calderas, that any citizen may see their own record on the day they ask for it, without fee, without cause given, and take a copy away in their own hand. He said, when they asked him why the copy mattered so much, that one copy could be burned. They still tell it wrong, mostly. In the popular version, the Alpha King brings a poor girl to a poorhouse to test her, and she suffers beautifully, and he is moved, and he takes her home and gives her a crown. And it is a lovely story, and it changes nothing, and that is exactly why it is the version that gets told. Here is what actually shocked him. She did not weep, and she did not run, and she did not perform her virtue for the men with the brass armbands who had been sent to watch her be virtuous. She counted the beds. She counted the shirts. She taught 9 children their letters so that they could copy a column of numbers that a chancellor had assumed no one in that building would ever be able to read. And in doing it, she turned his test inside out, because a test only measures the person standing in it if you are very careful never to hand them the ledger. They made Tamsin Reed kneel on the marble of the Hall of Bells, and demanded she prove she was worthy of them. 9 years later, there is a scuff worn into that same black and white marble, 40 feet long, where the boots of the Commons of Bells come in on the 4th day of every quarter to ask the monarch of Calderas what the accounts say, and the stone is bare there, and the polishers are forbidden to touch it. So the question was never whether she was worthy of the throne. The question, then and now, and probably tomorrow, is the one nobody in that hall had the nerve to ask out loud on the night they made her kneel. Who exactly was being tested, and who gave them the right?